Ever since humans took their first steps on this world, we always look to the stars, wondering what can be just beyond our planet's atmosphere. For a millennium, this question would go unanswered, until on one faithful August afternoon in the year 1835, an article would release claiming life was just discovered on the moon. Discoveries so alien, yet so familiar. Creatures that looked like twisted amalgamations of man and bat. Lunar unicorns found prancing in the moon's prairies. Even intelligent beavers that had a whole primitive society, all contained on the moon's surface. Overnight, the articles became mainstream. Every person in New York was talking about these otherworldly discoveries. Amazed that we weren't alone in this universe, we weren't even alone in our own solar system. But as excitement died down, people started to become more skeptical about the nature of these articles. If you don't know who I am, I'm Todd, and let me take you guys on this lunar trip around the moon. Before we talk about bat people and space unicorns, let me give you guys a quick little background on the article and the astronomers it follows. Got it? Good. Let's go. The Great Moon Hoax of 1835 is one of the most famous cases of a hoax. The article was released in 6 parts, spanning 6 days, from August 25th to 31st. The paper mainly follows Sir John Herschel and his assistant, Dr. Andrew Grant. John Herschel was a prominent astronomer in the 18th century. He charted more than 60,000 stars and a countless amount of nebulas in his lifetime. He wasn't a no-name, he was an established astronomer that people would listen to. As for his assistant, I'll talk more about him later. Now, let's go right into day 1. To observe the surface of the moon in great detail, you would need a powerful telescope, something much more powerful than what was around during that time. That is the same dilemma that John Herschel had. So, to get the funds for this project, he went to the Royal Society of England to ask for aid. Herschel was no stranger to the society, working as a secretary for them for a short while. The Royal Committee was on board with Herschel's proposal, only wanting any information regarding improvements in navigation. A new telescope would help with navigation, so the Royal Committee approved the construction of the telescope. The telescope would cost around £70,000. Giving a rough estimate, it would have costed £7.7 million, or around 10.5 million USD in the modern day. The chairman was so enthusiastic about this idea that he donated £10,000 of his own money to the cause. In the modern day, that would be around 1.1 million pounds, or around 1.3 million in USD. The telescope itself was described to be of new principle. It was something never seen before. Herschel used this telescope to seemingly find out every mystery that the universe had, charting new planets, stars, and galaxies. The machine was massive, having an aperture size of around 24 feet, which is even big for the modern times. To put in perspective, it would be bigger than the MMT telescope in Arizona, which has an aperture size of around 21 feet. But what made this telescope truly special was its second lens, this being a hydro-oxygen magnifier. This thing was an absolute beast, allowing the telescope to achieve a magnification up to 42,000 times, while producing a crystal clear image. That's not all it had to offer. The telescope was able to project an image onto a canvas 50 feet in diameter. After construction of the telescope, Herschel, accompanied by his assistant Dr. Andrew Grant, and a group of royal engineers, astronomers, and a ton of mechanics, sailed all the way to South Africa for construction of the new observatory. The observatory was complete around the end of December. This is when observations of our moon finally started. The observations of our moon began January 10th, 1835. The first thing the astronomers saw were these greenish-brown hexagonal columns. They looked very similar to our earthly basalt columns. These columns had a width of around 28 inches, and there were around 6 of them in a cluster. The rocks were covered in dark red flowers, these flowers being almost identical to roses. This was the first sign of lunar life. This also showed that the moon had an atmosphere that could support life. These formations were found all over the moon's surface. The next thing they came across was a lunar forest. This forest had these huge trees that had the size and look of yay trees. On the outskirts of this forest was a green plain spanning half a mile long. Another forest was discovered, this one consisting of just normal fir trees. As the men continued their journey, they found that the countryside of the moon was covered in volcanic activity with the abundance of lichen. They eventually stumbled on an inland sea. The men figured that this was the Mare Nubium, since the outline matched their map. The water was described to be as blue as the deep ocean, while large white waves were found all over. It seemed like the sea was in a perpetual state of high tide. Side note, mares are just giant basaltic plains that are found on the moon. When you look up at the moon and see the gray spots, those are mares. The shores of the sea were glimmering white. Green marble and chasms were found all over. The chasms themselves were made of chalk and gypsum. Around them were a species of unknown tree. As the scientists continued their lunar journey, they came across a chain of obelisks. The obelisks were made of around 30 to 40 spires, all of them being perfectly square. They were around 60 to 90 feet tall. The structures gave off a very faint purple hue. After zooming in on them, it was discovered that they were made of a reddish-purple amethyst. The crystals were mostly found on the edge of lunar valleys. The formations had rusty-looking stones all over them. The scientists concluded that these stones were most likely iron pyrites. As the men continued, they approached the shores of the Mare Funkitatis. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Anyways, the sea was around 300 miles long, while having a coastline that was entirely composed of flint and chalk. Beyond the sea, they found a mountainous region filled with forests. The trees of the forests resembled oak trees, but with glossy leaves and yellow flowers that hung from their branches. The next discovery was an oval-shaped valley, being named the Valley of the Unicorn. It was found between the Mare Funkitatis and the Mare Nectaris. The valley was around 18 to 20 miles in diameter. This area was surrounded by deep chasms, red mountains, and polygon-shaped crystals, besides a small opening in the south. Cascades were present all along the cliffs of the valley. At the foot of the mountains was a lush forest, perfectly surrounded by the whole valley. The forest consisted of many types of unknown tree species. The astronomers then spotted a group of brown quadrupeds, these animals having the same characteristics as a bison, besides being smaller in stature and having an appendage over their eyes. It crossed the whole forehead and was attached by the ears. The scientists theorized that it was used to protect the animal's eyes from the extreme light of the sun and the dark of deep space. The ears would lift and lower the appendage when needed. It's basically like a natural visor. This trait was observed in most lunar animals they found. The next animal discovered was a bluish, goat-sized creature with a single horn. Curiously, dimorphism was observed in the species. Females had no horn or beard, but a longer tail. The creature seemed to have some kind of telepathic ability. When the men put their hands on the creature's image, it would spring away, almost like it felt like it was being touched. The creature they just described is basically just a unicorn. In the middle of the valley was a large branching river filled with small islands. Countless species of birds lived here. The most common of these birds were gray pelicans and a black and white crane. One of the islands possessed a round, amphibious creature which was found on the shore. It moved by rolling around like a ball. This last finding marked the end of Day 2's observations. The next night's observations began with the exploration of the western districts, Endymion, Cleomedes, Langrenus, and Pedvitus. The region consisted of 3 mountains. 2 mountains looked like ovals and were united by a cluster of hills. The last mountain looked like a cut rope knot, surrounded by smaller hills. On the western ridge of these mountains was an active volcano, found mid-eruption. Northeast of the mountains were 2 other mountainous regions, the Vagabond Mountains and another oval-shaped range named the Mare Mortuum, or Lake of Death. In the Mare Mortuum, 2 extinct volcanoes were found. The diameter of both openings were around 450 feet, while the rim of the volcano was 1,000 feet. The volcanoes reached a height of 2,800 feet, and the interior of the craters were stained yellow. The lands surrounding the volcanoes were lush, 12 lunar forests being observed, divided by vast prairies. In these prairies reside more bison-like creatures, these ones being bigger than their cousins. They then set their eyes on the district of Endymion. In this district, Herschel classified 38 new species of trees and double this amount in smaller plant life. He classified 9 new species of mammal and 5 new species of ovipara. The men found small reindeer-like creatures, animals similar to elk and moose, horned bears, and lastly, a bipedal beaver. These beavers were almost identical to the beavers of Earth, besides being able to walk on 2 feet and having no tail. The beavers showed the intellect of early man, living in huts and having discovered fire. The beavers were found to reside on the side of lunar lakes and rivers. South of the beavers was the district of Cleomedes. A ring-shaped mountain was found in this area, having 3 craters on top of it. The top of these craters are home to large white birds that resemble storks. The valley around the mountain was surrounded by dense forests. On the south part of the valley was a natural archway, 200 feet in height and 100 feet in width. A river ran under the archway, leading to a waterfall. The water fell into a stream that spans miles out. 20 miles from this waterfall is the largest inland sea on the lunar surface. The sea is about 198 miles wide and 266 miles long. Islands were found all over the sea, most of them being volcanic in nature. 2 of them were mid-eruption. In the bay on the west side of the sea resides an island 55 miles in diameter and having a unique crescent form. The island was covered with tall quartz crystals, the quartz having an orange-yellow hue. A dark green forest also resides on the island, while lunar palm trees are on its shore. The palm trees had large crimson flowers instead of green leaves of a typical palm tree. No fruit was found on these trees, but they did find a type of lunar melon growing in the island's forest. The cliffs of the island were eroded by the tide. The walls appeared cavernous, with yellow crystal stalagmites protruding from them. The whole island appeared to be crystallized itself. The astronomers found more animal life, one being a striped quadruped about 3 feet in height. This animal roamed in small herds. It's basically just a smaller zebra. More types of birds were discovered, these birds being golden and blue pheasants. On the shores of the sea were wide and flat shellfish and other gastropods. As they explored the mainland, they found spires of jewels all over. Seasons were even observed on the moon, but they worked differently from how they do back at home. All the seasons were happening at the same time, and this was the conclusion of their studies on day 3. The night's observations began with the finding of a narrow, dark-colored lake surrounded by a valley. The lake was found southwest of the Valley of the Unicorn by about 160 miles. The lake had a diameter of 70 miles. Like the valley, the lake had a shape of a semicircle. The south part of the valley opens to a plain of hills, and forest lines the whole coast of the lake. Yellow metal was observed in the strata of the mountains. The men concluded that this was some type of gold. More animal life was found here, the first of them being a quadruped with a long neck, head of a sheep, and 2 long spiraling horns on its head. The horns of the animals were described to be as white as polished ivory. It had the body of a deer with long front legs and short back ones. Its tail was snowy white and curled over its body. The color of the animal was bright blue with accents of white. It was only found in pairs. The next animal they found were just normal sheep, but they were a little larger than their earthly counterparts. They were found grazing in massive herds on the moon's prairies. Strangely though, the sheep had no eye appendage that most of the lunar animals had. As the astronomers set their eyes back on the valley, they zoomed in on an especially narrow part. Here they saw massive dark crags and a forest below that almost seemed like it was floating. East of this area was a massive crag. This crag was curved and hung over the valley's lake. The crag was deep red in color, like the surrounding mountains. On the western face of the mountains, bat-like creatures descended from the cliffs onto the valley's floor. 3 parties were observed, consisting of 12 to 15. When they landed, they walked upright to the nearby forest. The creatures were around 4 feet in height and were covered in short, glossy, copper-colored hair besides the face. The wings of the creature were made of a thin membrane and laid retracted on its back when it walked. The wings spanned from the shoulders to the calves, being connected to the body all the way down, basically like a natural wingsuit. The creature's face was similar to an orangutan while being yellowish in color. A thick beard laid on its lower jaw. The hair on its head was darker than the rest of its body, the hair being finely curled. The creatures were able to communicate with one another with speech and gestures. The creatures were promptly named the Vespertilio Homo, or Man-Bat. The valley where these creatures were found in was now classified as the Ruby Coliseum. This extraordinary discovery marked the end of day 4. On day 5, the men decided to map the rest of the moon's surface. The lunar surface was found to be covered in lakes, oval-shaped mountains, and volcanoes. One of these volcanoes was unique, standing 330 miles tall. It stood around 300 miles into the largest ocean, connected to the mainland by a chain of 4 smaller mountains. The surface of the moon was found to have 3 large oceans and several smaller seas. The biggest ocean occupied most of the moon's northern axis and equator. Islands, caves, peninsulas, and promontories filled the whole ocean. One of these promontories was shaped like an imperial crown. 6 lakes were present on this landmass in total, all divided by hills. 2 of these lakes are 80 miles long, and one of them is perfectly square, this one being bigger than the previous. The ridge goes 396 miles into the ocean. The second ocean is named the Mare Tranquillitatis. The ocean is west of the meridian line and divided by the equator. The ocean is about 900 miles long and is divided into 2 parts by an opening that is around 100 miles long. This ocean only had 3 massive islands, while several volcanoes existed on its northern coast. The last ocean is named the Mare Serenitatis. It is separated from the Mare Tranquillitatis by smaller islands and continents. The ocean is nearly square, about 330 miles in diameter. The ocean has a perfectly straight ridge of quartz crystals that extend from the north to the south shores. There is a single chasm that spans the whole way of the ridge. One opening is present in the middle. The ridge is around 340 miles long, having a width of 5 miles. Close to the first ocean is an inland sea. The sea is filled with promontories and islands. One of the promontories was narrow and curved. It ran 264 miles from its starting point of Pictatus to its ending point, Borealis. Pictatus is an active lunar volcano within a cape on the south shore of the sea, and Borealis is a long, dormant volcano. West of Pictatus is a ring-shaped valley of hills. This valley was snow white. It was most likely made of crystal or marble. The center of the valley was a vibrant green foresty area teeming with life. It was theorized by the scientists that this is where local lunar life might go when the volcanoes are active. The hills could serve as a shield against the eruption. On the east side of the valley stood 3 blue temples made of sapphire or some other blue stone. The structure stood 100 feet in height, having a round green base. The temple was triangular in shape, with glowing gold engraved on its surface. Each side of the temple possessed 6 square columns, 6 feet in width at the base and 17 feet tall. The space between the columns were 12 feet. The roof of the temple was made of a yellow metal, equally divided into 3 sections. Architectural scrolls lined the edge of the roof. Fire even came out of the top of it. Engulfed in the flames was a large sphere situated in the center of the roof. The sphere was made of a dark type of metal, having the color of clouded copper. Each corner had its own smaller sphere. The building had openings on each side, making 4 in total. The floor of the building was glistening white. There were no altars, there were no seats, no offerings. The temple was completely empty. It is not known what the purpose of this structure is. And this concludes their studies on day 5. final night's observations started right where they left off. Next to the temples were multiple groups of Vespertilio Homo, but this group was different. These ones were larger and were lighter in color. The groups were eating large yellow fruit that had the look and shape of a gourd. They also found smaller red fruits shaped like cucumbers. The fruits were mostly found on trees with dark leaves. There was an abundance of these red fruits near the groups. The creatures were not eating the red fruit, just sucking the juices from them. The astronomers observed something unusual with the bat folk. The mass seemed to be throwing fruit at the largest one in their group. The biggest one seemed like their leader. The leader would put its hands on its head at an acute angle. Each member would follow, extending their hands the same way. This was done right before the group would disperse. This was a sign of social hierarchy within the species. The creatures were never found to be engaged in any work or making art. It seemed they spent their days in bliss with the environment around them, collecting fruit, flying, talking, and lingering at the top of cliffs. Most of the lunar species found were all gathered here. 9 new species of quadruped were also found here. One new animal found was a tall white stag with long, spreading antlers. These creatures had no fear of the Vespertilio Homos. They even went up to groups and ate vegetation right next to them. It seemed like the moon had no carnivorous creatures at all. All the animals of the moon lived in harmony with one another. After the night's observations, the moon was unable to be observed for the rest of the month. In another stroke of bad luck, the observatory went up in flames. They were able to stop the fire before the building completely burned down. Luckily, the lenses were out of the observatory for cleaning, but most of the metallic reflectors melted. Amazingly, they were able to fix the observatory within a week. In the next month of March, they were able to continue their studies on the moon. The astronomers decided to map out the rest of the lunar surface. The first thing they found was a mountain range on the countryside, naming the respective mountains Atlas, Hercules, Heraclides Verus, and Heraclides Falsus. North of the mountains was a circle of islands called Pythagoras. Near the meridian line was a mountainous region, having 2 distinct districts called the Land of Drought and the Land of Hoarfrost. The mountains in the Land of Frost had been covered in snow, while the land under them was in the midst of a summer. They next set their eyes on Heraclides Falsus. They found several new species of animal life. All the life found had horns, while being gray and white. 3 remains were found of sapphire temples, long abandoned. The astronomers then went south to the mountains of Atlas. In one of the surrounding valleys were the superior Vespertilio Homos, but it seemed like these ones were much more advanced compared to their cousins. They had an advanced hierarchy, ceremonies, and art all over the valley. They had skills not seen before. This final discovery marked the end of their observations for good. So, how did the people react to these articles? Most accounts from this time say that a majority of people believed the story was true. People were excited that we weren't alone in the universe. We weren't even alone in our own solar system. What made this story believable was that John Herschel himself was in South Africa charting stars during the release of the articles. Adding to this, a year before the articles came out, John Herschel stated that he believed there was a chance for life to be present on the moon, stating that telescopes must yet be greatly improved before we could expect to see signs of inhabitants, as manifested by edifices or by changes of the surface of the soil. So, it seemed like he was interested in lunar life and the advancement in telescope technology. People were even claiming that they saw the telescope in London getting loaded onto a boat, and that they were in possession of the Sun's Edinburgh Journal of Science, which was not real. All of this gave the story a heap of credibility. The Sun profited heavily from this story. Circulation of their articles almost tripled overnight. The Sun would defend the articles, stating consummate arrogance is always incredulous to the higher order of scientific discoveries because it could not possibly comprehend them. In simple terms, they were saying if you didn't believe the story, you were just a plain idiot and arrogant to the new scientific discovery. All of this resulted in the series of articles becoming huge in New York. But as it started to expand to Europe and the rest of the country, people became more skeptical. Some articles publishing the story would give their own doubts, even adding disclaimers to them. But it didn't matter. The Sun gained the traction they wanted. The newspaper would keep this momentum, lasting all the way up to 1950 when they merged with a rival newspaper company called the New York World Telegram. But this operation didn't last long, closing their doors permanently in 1967. That was a lot to unpack, but now let's break down some of the holes in the story. A telescope being made of that size would have been a huge technological advancement. To put in perspective, the largest telescope at the time was the Great 40-foot. Funnily enough, made by Herschel's father. The telescope had an aperture size of 4 feet and was used all the way up to 1840. The lens of the new telescope would be 6 times bigger, like mentioned previously, matching even the biggest modern telescopes. It would be kind of like going from the first airplane to a stealth bomber in 5 years. It's really just not possible. The hydro-oxygen magnifier is never explained either. They just came up with it one day. The lenses are even referred to as magic at points. The articles reference the Edinburgh Journal of Science throughout. While the journal is real, it was made years before the articles came out. The Sun claimed that they got their version of the journal from a medical gentleman in Scotland, which can really mean anything. Interestingly, 2 years before the moon hoax was made, an article by the Sun was released about how it would be impossible for a telescope to be powerful enough to see the surface of the moon. Even Dr. Andrew Grant, John Herschel's assistant, wasn't a real person. He was made up for the sake of the story. So, if John Herschel didn't write the story, who did? We don't exactly know who wrote the set of articles, but most historians believe it was Richard Adam Locke. Locke was born September 22nd, 1800. He was wealthy growing up, having a bright future ahead of him. But instead of going to college and becoming the head of his family's estate, Locke became a small-time writer, writing political newspapers and smaller journals. This resulted in a divide between him and his family. Struggling as a writer, Locke would eventually move to New York City for better opportunities. This is where he became a reporter. While reporting a murder trial, he was approached by Benjamin Day, the owner of The Sun, to write an article about the case. Locke agreed to write the article. The paper skyrocketed, selling around 10,000 copies. They wanted Locke to write more of these popular articles, so Locke came up with the infamous hoax. Both men refused to say the article was a hoax, even months after it was disproven, but in private, Locke did admit to writing the story. Locke's confession was to a fellow writer named Finn. They were both staying at a hotel where Finn made a passing comment about the reprint of the article. Locke responded by saying that he was the true writer of the story. Locke eventually left the Sun in 1836, 1 year after the hoax was made. He then joined a rival newspaper called the New Era. This is where he would write an article crediting himself as the writer of the moon hoax. Quick side note, Locke also made another hoax during this time about finding the lost diary of missing Scottish explorer Mungo Park, but this one wasn't as successful. This partnership with New Era didn't last long, as he soon left in 1839, going back to being a standalone reporter. Locke's last article was for the News World's newspaper in 1840, finally making a public confession and apologizing for the whole ordeal. In 1842, Locke left writing and reporting for good, being banished to work at customer services until 1862 when he finally retired. On February 16, 1871, Locke passed away at 71 years old in Staten Island, New York, ending the long lunar saga. Like mentioned previously, John Herschel was in South Africa during this time. It did take him a bit of time to first hear about this story, but when he did, he actually wasn't too bothered by it, getting a good laugh. But 2 years after the story was published, he wrote a letter to his aunt about how he was frustrated that he was constantly asked and questioned about the hoax. One last letter was recovered in 2001. This was an unsent letter to the Athenaeum magazine by Herschel. The letter stated that he wanted the paper to put disclaimers about the hoax and his involvement with it. I can understand where he's coming from. It probably would get really annoying after a while. No one's talking about your actual discoveries. People are talking about the fake discoveries you made. All things considered, I think the story was very interesting. There was a lot more than I thought there was going to be. talking about the 6 articles, it was a cool story. It was unintentionally one of the first forms of science fiction and one of the first world building projects that was made. As for the reaction people gave, I don't blame them for falling for it. It's easy for us to say that people back then were just dumb and gullible, but we say that when we have phones and computers where we have millions of years of information at our fingertips. They couldn't look up the old newspaper, they couldn't look up the journal, and they couldn't know that Grant wasn't a real person. We also have long distance communication. Back then, it took the world weeks to communicate. It would take a bit of time for Herschel to say that the story wasn't real. The only real source of information they had was the news and what others told them. If I was back in that time, I would believe it too. I know that was a long one. Thank you guys so much for watching to the end. This was my first video, so it's not going to be the greatest, but I will definitely continue on improving. Once again, thank you guys so much for watching. See you guys in the next one.